and good afternoon. This is Jonathan Bloom of Bloom Consulting. Today we're going to talk about ETL and why we have so many choices in Azure. So, a little bit about me. Bloom Consulting is a side business I've been running since 2000. I do projects including data governance as well as the Azure data ecosystem. So ETL, if you're working in code, we have data in one place when needed, move it to another place, and then a lot of times we apply business rules and transformation. So I extracted the Wikipedia definition here, but suffice to say, it's traditionally used in data warehousing, and then business rules are applied through the ecosystem, through the life cycle, and we kick off these jobs using pipelines. Back in the day, we would use SQL Server Integration Services, which is part of the Microsoft BI stack, and that's the on-prem version. You can use that in the cloud within Azure Data Factory, but I've only used the Azure Data Factory pipelines, to be honest. So speaking of Azure Data Factory, you can move the data from point A to point B, and then you're going to apply some business rules and transformations. And we typically leverage tools such as Azure Databricks. So Databricks will work on any platform, but the one that I've been using is specifically in Azure. So it runs a cluster in the background, Spark pools, and basically you can kick off these notebooks that have code within them, whether Python, Scala, or SQL. And then those notebooks can be parameterized. You can lock them down for specific permissions. And when your Azure Data Factory runs, it spins up the cluster, so it may take a few minutes the first time to scale up. Once it's running, it'll execute those Python scripts within the notebook, and then it can handle large volumes. So you can access data from the ADLS, SQL, as well as a variety of other places. So within Azure Data Factory, we also have something called data flows, and data flows also use Spark pools. So there's an additional cost. So for whatever you're paying for the ADF, you'll also have an increased cost for the Spark pools. Sometimes I've seen them, not tremendously expensive, but the monthly fee I've seen 1,700 or so. But don't quote me on that because it changes all the time. Also depends on your usage. Those are estimated costs in the Azure cost estimator. The nice thing about it, since you use Spark, you can do large data sets. And what's nice about it, if you're from the SSIS world, it has a similar drag and drop visual coding style rather than writing code in Python or Scala or SQL. Like I said, you can also run in SSIS, but I've never used that feature. Another thing I didn't mention here is, but when I started in Azure, they had something called UseSQL. So I actually got my first taste of Azure using UseSQL, and I kind of like that tool, but I don't really see a lot of companies using that. So another method you can use for ETL and Azure Data Factory is you can actually kick off a stored procedure or an inline query from within your pipelines. So Azure Data Factory is good at moving the data from A to B or C or D, but it doesn't really get to the low-level transformations, as that's why we have to leverage these other tools to do that. And a lot of times, if you're going to access data from on-prem or what have you, you have to install the self-hosted integration runtime. Next, I want to talk about Azure Synapse. So Azure Synapse is a great tool. I've used it on multiple projects, and basically, it will also move data from A to B, C, D, and then also you can apply the business rules and the transformations using such tools as Synapse. So we have notebooks embedded within Azure Synapse, and you can execute that code, PySpark or PySQL in Scala, and essentially that's one way of replicating pipeline notebooks within your Synapse. We also have data flows. So data flows also use the Synapse Spark pool. So it has its own Synapse Spark pool. So when you do the install of Synapse, it'll ask you, do you want the Spark pool? And you say yes, and then it'll actually be a separate pool running alongside the dedicated SQL pool. It will also handle large volumes, and it also leverages the drag and drop visual coding pattern. You can also execute code within the Azure SQL database, Synapse database. So Synapse is actually designed to handle large scale, large volume data. So from my understanding, it's a remnant of Azure from parallel data warehousing, which I've used on several projects. But essentially, that used to be a box you could purchase, and it would be delivered to your facility. And then it would have like 8 SQL servers running together in the same box, and it would splice the data across all 8 SQL servers. And then when you kicked off the job, it would identify where the shards are, those pieces of data, and then it can handle large volumes. So I think that was the predecessor of like Hadoop or large scale databases what we see today. But in Azure Synapse, they do have a SQL language which is close to the SQL that we're familiar with, the T-SQL, but it is slightly different. And the reason is it stores the data a little differently in the background. And it too has its own self-hosted integration runtime. Now, Fabric is really cool. So I had a chance to play with that quite a bit, and it went GA yesterday, which was November 15th of 2023. And the nice thing about it is I forgot to change the word Synapse here to Fabric, but it can move data from A to B and apply the business rules and transformation. It has the notebooks with the PySpark. It has something called Dataflow Gen 1, which is basically the Power Query M language that we're used to in Power BI. Now, they do have a new one called Gen 2, and if you go in there, they have like get data, and it basically it uses the Power Query functionality. It's pretty cool, but it is a Gen 2, and that's where a lot of the new developments being created. And along here on the side, if you can read this, it has some of the features, the differences between the Gen 1 and Gen 2. All I can tell you is I would recommend the Gen 2, unless for some reason you needed to stick with the legacy Gen 1. It too has the self-hosted integration runtime, from what I saw, is coming soon. But it does have something called the One Lake connector, which is fairly new, and basically it allows you to connect your objects. You can download the plugin thing, and essentially it'll allow you to connect to your One Lake drive from your local laptop through your Explorer browser. So that's kind of cool. The last way we want to show is the Power BI. So we've had Power BI from Excel into the desktop edition and then with the portal and the paginated. But essentially in Power BI, we can apply business rules transformation using the Power Query, which is basically the M language underneath, and you can record the steps. So you just start typing and it records the steps, and then you can modify and tweak that in the advanced editor to modify that code. We also have the data flows, which we talk about the Gen 1 with the self-service data prep. And it does require a Power BI data gateway in some instances. So if you've seen some of my other blogs and videos, I focus on data governance, purview, and such, but I also code in Azure as an architect and a lead on projects where we are doing full-blown implementations of data-driven pipelines. And when we formulate a strategy for a client, we have to go through what their requirements are and formulate the best strategy on which selection of technology we're going to choose. I would say very rarely do we choose the Power BI to do our ETL, but it is possible. Traditionally, we use the data factory, and then it seemed like there was a shift into Synapse for a while, and then we focused a lot on the Synapse, and now it seems like they're kind of backtracking a little bit and going back towards the data factory. And the reason I say that is because the example is on a project they wanted us to use change data capture, and change data capture has a new component, but they only added it to the data factory. It wasn't added to the Synapse. So that's where I get my information from, is that they're investing on the ADF side. It would also tell me that I would imagine that the ADF is going to mimic the Fabric side quite a bit. So I mean, if everyone's already invested in these technologies, there's nothing wrong with that. But I can't see a lot of people going into the Fabric now. And the reason is there may be some upfront installation with getting it installed, but it's definitely easier to connect to your components, your resources within Azure. Like I could spend half a day setting up my permissions so that ADF can talk to the ADLS by setting the storage blob reader and writer. You have to set it in the SQL database, so you got to add the commands to create the users and grant the access. I imagine all this configuration and security is being handled under the scene, under the hoods, within the Fabric, as well as the built-in Fabric purview within the Fabric. And I do like the One Lake connector, and it just seems like it's also integrated with the Azure ML, the ML stuff. So I could definitely see people, coming in fresh from the cloud, on-prem to the cloud. They're probably going to start with the Fabric. So I definitely see a lot of interest in that. And I do keep tabs of this because I deploy it all the time. I don't just specialize in the purview, full service Azure data ecosystem. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that, create a quick video. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.